Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I know we got a few people that are going to be joining us here soon. But welcome everybody to class 6 of PA 509 Political Economy. And tonight we are going to get started in the next part of the text, which involves the constraints of good governance, and talk about some important aspects to consider that serve to put significant headwinds on the development and implementation of policy. And there are things that we have to take into consideration with our work. And the text does a good job of kind of providing some background on it. And we'll definitely have some good discussion. And there's a example that's currently going on globally, actually across the pond in Great Britain, that deserves some evaluation by us here. And that's what we'll talk a little bit about to begin with. But I hope to have a good class with y'all tonight, and I hope everybody's ready for it. So we'll go ahead and get started. And so we're going to have it's not an open discussion. It's actually going to be a structured discussion. There were two articles that I sent out. One that I thought I had sent out earlier today, and I did not until just a few minutes before class began. And then second, it was kind of a follow-up to it. To kind of give an idea of a situation, of an economic situation going on in the UK, and it does tie a little bit to some of the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight in the overall discussion of the constraints on good governance. And then go into chapters 7 and 8 to talk about strategic adjustment and dynamic inconsistency. And these are two very broad topics that are they're not easy to explain, but I hope in the course of your study of these two chapters, you kind of gain an understanding really of what we're talking about. And there's some good examples, particularly with respect to strategic adjustment, that are used in talking about two of our more challenging international and domestic policy issues that we have, the issues with counterterrorism and also the war on drugs. Then there's an exercise that I'd like to have y'all work on, and then we will go into discussing what's on tap for week 7. Are there any questions? Okay, seeing none. So let's take a little look, and I want to use the Market Watch article first, which was the second article that I sent out. So there is a very serious issue that's going on right now in the UK. And it kind of got overshadowed a lot by the death of Queen Elizabeth II and the subsequent period of mourning, which was planned as per royal and government doctrine. But UK is facing a challenge that a lot of other countries are right now in Europe, and that is dealing with this tremendous rise of inflation, particularly with respect to energy cost and in other areas. And there are various governments in Europe are trying to address it, and the UK is one of them. And as the Sky News article that I shared also discussed, last week, following the end of the mourning period, they presented kind of an interim budget. It was kind of like a secondary budget, more like some of the additional appropriations that we have here domestically. And we're trying to figure out how do they address the challenges that the British people are facing with respect to the cost of energy primarily. There are other factors as well, but the most significant issue that they are facing domestically as they go into the winter months is the price of energy. And they were trying to establish some kind of subsidy program, emergency subsidy program that would benefit the British people. And they are not in a position to be able to pay for this as they go along. They're going to have to raise debt, much like we have here recently for the various stimulus programs that were implemented during and after the COVID pandemic. And so they are now in a situation where they are taking a significant hit because the markets for their new debt and for their current debt are not as attractive as they were before they made this announcement. As the British budget continues to increase, even though Britain is in the position of being a reserve currency, the pound is considered a reserve currency, much like that of the US dollar. Not as strong of a reserve currency, but is considered a reserve currency nonetheless in the global markets, um, they are suffering some significant challenges, and we're almost at a point right now where it's possible by the end of this week that the British pound will actually be valued less than the US dollar, which I'm trying to go back in my mind. I don't think there's been a time in my lifetime that has been the case. Typically, the British pound has been far more valuable than that of the US dollar for various reasons. And this is the same fate that's hit the euro already this year. We talked a little bit about that last week. But this is a pretty significant hit. And the end result is with interest rates on British debt. This is Lawrence Summers, also known as Larry Summers. He was an economic advisor in the Clinton administration as well as in the Obama administration. He was formerly the head of Harvard University. He is probably one of the most, and he's also former U.S. Treasury Secretary. He is probably one of the most easily identified and notable economists and economic policy makers and advisors on the center left of the United States political spectrum, and has been for the last 20 plus years. And he is of course expressing some concerns that he has. He spoke out during the Biden administration's advance of various policies in 2021. He spoke out about them in terms of their potential to cause inflation. And he is certainly expressing the same here, and has shared some tweets that he posted yesterday, that this could have significant issues to the sustainability of Britain's economy, and even talks about that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which typically we associate with non-reserve currency nations, has not said anything yet about this. And this has the potential to be a significant issue. And also the issue of the possibility that the pound may reach a point of parity with the US dollar and the euro. The euro, for most of its history, has been above the US dollar, but has reached parity this year. And of course, now the pound looks like to be reaching in that as well. And again, the key factor is, and I'll just highlight this, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain has proposed kind of a mini budget or an interim budget that includes a series of tax cuts, which is consistent with the political motivations of traditionally of the conservative movement in Great Britain, but also a considerable subsidy program to offset energy costs. Great Britain, even though it's not on the European mainland, is facing the same challenges with energy cost as their mainland counterparts, due to the reliance on that regional market for natural gas and other petroleum products that are primarily imported from Russia, or where Russia plays a significant part of the overall market. And that is having a significant impact on energy costs right now. And obviously energy costs are a significant issue to us here too in the United States, but the issue in Europe is even more significant. And this is not something that just started with the situation in Ukraine. This was already taking place because Europe has been moving forward with a long-term policy in respect to energy, of trying to move their energy portfolio over towards green renewables. This has been going on for the last several years. And in doing so, they have also tried to go ahead and decommission existing fossil fuel and nuclear power facilities. So they've had they're not really in the best place to be able to accommodate such a rapid spike in those resources is still available to them. They're kind of stuck with some peak demand, with some peak supply, and peak demand issues in particular times. And so what it's done is that it has made their debt in the UK, also known as the gilt, interesting phrase to use for debt, very more expensive because it's not attractive to markets. Typically, when bonds are attractive, people buy more of them and the overall yield goes down. But when bonds are not as attractive, you have to make them attractive by raising the yields up. And of course, that means an increase in effective interest rates. And that's what they're facing right now, that they're looking at a yield on their 10-year note of about over 4%. And that has spiked just in the last week. Prior to this week, it was below 3%, and now it is over 4%. And that significantly increases borrowing cost. I mean, you can kind of effectively look at it. You'd be dramatically increasing borrowing cost by just going up 1 percentage point. If you start out at 3 and you go to 4, that's you can think that's like increasing it by a third. So this is the challenge that they have in Great Britain. And there are a lot of people, including there are a lot of people out there that are starting to look at this and go, wait a second. And you may ask yourself, why is this as significant of a concern out there when you think about how in the retail market, obviously the government's paying a lower interest rate for its debt compared to what we pay as homeowners and such for debt. But why would such a event be so dramatic and have such a potential negative impact? Anyone?
Could you ask that question one more time? I was listening, but I just didn't quite get it.
Anthony, did you say anything?
Yes, I was just asking, could you ask that question?
Hold on one second. I'm not able to hear you, so hold on just 1 second.
Oh.
Okay, try again, Anthony.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, for whatever reason, I'm not able to hear. I don't know why. Can somebody else just speak and let me see if I hear them? I don't know what's going on here.
Can you hear me? I don't think you can.
I hear you all though. I hear you.
Okay, I didn't hear anything, so I don't know what's going on. Hold on 1 second.
While we're waiting, did anybody catch the question? I was trying to figure it out, what he was asking.
I think it was something around I was trying to unfold it. It was a big wind up, but I think it was something more about like if this happened, or if it continued to drop, like what would the broader consequences be?
Right.
Oh,
Or
okay,
why is this a bad thing? Is that right? Like
Yeah.
okay.
The biggest challenge we have here, and it's very similar to what we saw in some other countries in 2008 and 2009 following the real estate crash that were in a far weaker economic position, like Greece and Italy. Those countries saw these were not what would be considered reserve or strong economic nations, even though they're established nations in Europe. The situation that we saw there was that they saw their debt, the cost, the interest rates on their debt increased significantly within a short period of time. And in the case of Italy, they saw their debt go up from about 3 or 4% up to about 6%. And for Italy, that almost made it unaffordable with respect to their ability to pay for it. what we have to understand is that our ability to borrow as much as we have in recent years is highly dependent upon the interest rates that we've been able to get for a lot of our debt. And this is as true in the United States as it is around the world. We've been able to get debt at very low rates. And that has a considerable challenge with respect to our ability to afford it, because obviously a significant share of our annual spending at the federal level already goes to debt service, and that's just to pay interest on debt. We're not paying principal. So the challenge we have going forward is that as these interest rates increase, because you are increasing the supply of debt that's out there, and you're creating a situation where people, because of inflation and because of other factors, are not as open to buy that debt at low rates. They want a higher return for it. It automatically increased borrowing costs, and so you're creating a very challenging situation for national budgets in that regard. And so someone like Summers looks back to what happened 13, 14 years ago and realizes that there is the potential for a similar incident to happen, and it would be far worse for it to happen in a country like the United Kingdom, to an economy like the United Kingdom, as opposed to, because it's a reserve currency nation. There are a lot of people who trade and hold pounds as an investment, and there's a sizable amount of business that does occur in pounds, that it could have potential significant global economic ramifications overall. And so those are the challenges that we're facing. And it's kind of important for us to understand, because this is happening in a very quick time frame. This is obviously, we know that inflation has been a challenge for a significant period of time, but the announcement of this policy by the British government has been pretty soon. This only was released in the past week, and that's very challenging. And Lindsay, to ask your question, I don't know who exactly owns UK's debt. It's a variety of parties. I would imagine that their debt portfolio in terms of ownership is similar to ours, in that some of it's probably domestically held by domestic investors, and I would imagine a share of it's held internationally by other countries, or by interest in other countries. So I don't have an exact idea of the UK portfolio, but the fact is, they're selling in the same global market that we are with respect to our debt. And obviously people have pointed out to the fact that over the past couple of decades, one of the areas of the world that's been the largest buyer of US debt is Asia, particularly Eastern Asia, Japan, China, and other Asian countries. And that has been, of some concern to individuals from a political as well as from a policy perspective. So that is the case. But the reality is that if you're going to increase your debt load, you have to have a market willing to buy it. And that's obviously something that has led to, and they're not in the same position. They obviously do have a bank that could buy it. The Bank of England could choose to buy it, much like the US, like the Federal Reserve Bank has chosen to buy US Treasuries from time to time. That's not supposed to happen, but it does happen. And there is the possibility that could take place as well. And you're absolutely right, Mary Cole, that a weaker dollar is usually better for exports. That's usually the case. And that is a problem. That's a concern as well. This is, as I mentioned last week, the last time, if you probably saw, there were a lot of Americans who traveled to Europe this summer, one, because it was the first time they could travel in a couple of years due to COVID, but also because, especially if you're traveling to an EU nation, prices were very reasonable compared to the US because of the falling of the euro. So they were able to get more value for their money across the pond. But the reality is that it does have negative consequences, particularly in the export market. So the US dollar has gained considerable strength during this period of time. And I'm not an economic expert when it comes to currencies, but it has gained considerable strength, which to some people is a good thing, but it does have negative consequences. There is a trade-off with respect to that, just like a weaker dollar has trade-off consequences. It's good. It can be good with respect to exports, but it also causes problems with respect to imports. So, trying to find the balance when it comes to the value of our currency is always a challenge. And it also does play a role with respect to the cost of our debt as well. So these are things that we have to take into consideration. But then there's also the overlying issue, which is now a global issue, and that is with respect to inflation.
Can you explain again what Summers, what he said should be done?
So what Summers has generally been advocating for the last year is that these additional spending measures that have been done by various administrations, including the Biden administration, need to be held back. That one of the biggest contributors to the overall influx in money supply that is driving markets up and causing an impact of inflation is itself is government spending. Now, Summers is not a proponent of trying to cut spending too much, but he does tend to believe into a certain degree of balance. And what he would say is that right now that we are overheating the economy with respect to spending, and he's seeing this happen in Great Britain. Because what Great Britain is doing is they are trying to respond to inflation with releasing more money into the marketplace. And what that does, while it has the potential in the initial thought to be able to alleviate the cost that households are going to face with respect to their energy costs, what you're not doing is keeping the money supply, is that the money supply is already too great on a large scale, on a macro scale. So while obviously what it does is that it provides no incentive to try to curtail spending in order to try to contain inflation. You don't have he's not a supply sider in general in terms of how he looks at things. And so Summers will say, because supplies are limited, and they are, because Britain's an island nation and it's only going to have so much energy supply, that because you're increasing the money, all you're doing is feeding the beast, as they would say, with respect to that. You're only increasing the supply of money that's out there. And you may think that it has the ability to help people offset their energy costs, but it's going to likely lead to inflation in other ways.
Because that's basically what happened with Greece, right?
Yes.
And then
the IMF stepped in and really didn't help matters all that. Well, the Greeks stepped in first, and then the Greeks stepped in first, and then the IMF tried to contain it. And
then they had a recession, right?
They had a recession and a revolt.
Yeah.
Because they tried the easiest method, which was through the pension program, but obviously that's also the most politically volatile one. And so that's what happened. You're absolutely right, Lindsay. There is, when you're dealing with inflation at this level, there is no easy way to address it. It's going to be painful nonetheless. There is no way to do it. And we have to understand that the inflation we're dealing with is likely the result of multiple factors. The two that are significant are, one, the supply chain constraints that were created by shutting down and then restarting the economy, because nothing starts back up as fast as it was when you shut it down. And second, the fact that we went through a prolonged period over 18 months of increasing the money supply through various government spending and Fed policy interventions without any effort to try to put any brake on it with respect to interest rates, because it was not only that we were increasing spending, but up until earlier this year, we did absolutely nothing with respect to interest rates. So what we're looking at is a situation that could be very similar to what we saw in 1981 in the early 80s, where in order to stop inflation, we had to, one, dramatically rise interest rates, and two, cut spending. And that served to provide the brake that was necessary to stop inflation. It had significant negative economic consequences. There's no doubt about that. It led to a recession. It caused issues in several sectors of the economy, the agriculture industry being one of them. There was a tremendous amount of pain in the agriculture industry during that time in the early to mid 80s. But it overall was able to bring some stability back to the economy. And that's what happened then. And there's a likelihood that that's going to happen again. We've seen what's happened with interest rates, and now there's the next part of it, which has to do with government spending, which I don't know what's going to happen there. That's likely something that's going to come about after that's going to be something that'll probably be worked out after the next election. And Anthony, that is, I can't believe that they didn't know that. You're right to ask that, because it's not like these things haven't happened before. When we get into discussion later this semester into modern monetary theory, there's some new ideas that are out there, but those of us, and I'm one of them, who have always said these ideas seem a little suspect. The fact is that traditionally speaking, what we're seeing right now has happened time and time again throughout the history of our economy. And it's really hard to look at it and not be surprised. If you've looked at economic history, the Dalio book kind of gets into this a little bit. You look at it and you kind of go, how did you expect it to be different? So those are serious things that we have to consider. Are there any questions that anybody else has?
I do have one more.
Sure.
So, you know how the federal government bailed out corporations in 2008 and other financial crises that we had?
Yes.
So, why is it possible? Not saying that this is like an actual thing, but if it were to occur that private company, like the largest corporations in America, buy the American debt at a loan to help the government?
You could possibly do that. Right now, the U.S. debt is not in the same position as debt in other countries. I mean, the interest rates have gone up a little bit, but it's still considered a value compared to other debt around the world. But that's entirely possible that could happen. Unfortunately, without getting too deep into political theology, it's highly likely that before they did that, the Federal Reserve would just buy the debt themselves with their own currency. So basically, the Federal Reserve would buy the debt instead of asking the companies to buy it. Your solution is more realistic. The only question would be that these company shareholders, if they went out and if they were asked, hey, we want you to buy this debt because, hey, you bailed us out, as you pointed out, 14 years ago, their shareholders would be asking like, well, wait a second, you're going to be only getting 3% return when we could be getting, 5 or 8% return on the market through profits with the excess cash they have. So it's not, you're absolutely right to ask that question. At the end of the day, it's probably likely there's going to likely be another solution. Okay, we're going to move on back to discussion with respect to chapter 7. And we'll start off with the introduction. And Lindsay, you're right. They're going to have to figure out how to do it either way, because at the end of the day, they got to pay for the juice. Everybody's got to pay for the juice. Constraints on good governance, and the introduction talks about a couple of different things, and I hope people had a chance to read through the introduction as well as through the 2 chapters. Kind of want to talk a little bit about something that happens all the time, and obviously they give a great example of this in the introduction with the sugar industry in the United States. But there is this concept known as rent seeking. Does anybody want to define for me rent seeking?
I guess I'll go. I'll try to give it a shot. So when I read it and watched the video gave like a really clear like outline of when the boat guy was making money. I mean, the landlord was making money off of something that was free. So it kind of just changed the market, and it made everything go up because of all the different things that went into it. So the guy he was fishing free, and then the guy put the little chain there, and then he had to pay to go through. So that made the cost of the service or good that the fisherman was selling. Also, is that like the overall gist of it? Like one thing leads to another and a higher price?
It can be. It starts off with the idea, JR.
They use policy to benefit a certain group of people in their favor.
And they tie together, and they tie together because when we talk about rent seeking in the broader economic sense, it's creating steps where you facilitate an uneven balance of you facilitate a transfer of wealth or income. So as Anthony gives in his example, you take something that's free, like access to a source of water, you put a constraint in the way that somebody has to go through, and that person has to pay a fee, and so somebody is basically having to transfer some of their income to somebody else for the same benefit that would otherwise be free, and as such, you're creating that's generally speaking what rent seeking can be. From a policy perspective, you're basically capturing these advantages that can exist, and this is something that happens all the time. When we talk about it ties again into economic development a lot of times. Probably the most vivid example has to do with the efforts that in recent history, and this is a pretty easy example, the efforts that pro sports team owners make to facilitate money from local state governments for stadium construction and renovations. Pro sports facilities are primarily taxpayer funded. There are a few examples where they're not, but even when they're not, when they're paid for by the team owners or by investors, they still utilize government debt instruments. And this is a prime example. These should theoretically be privately owned facilities because they're benefiting private purpose. They're not, a pro sports team is enjoyable. I am a pro sports fan, been a Dallas Cowboys fan all my life. Don't hold that against me. But the reality is that these are private interests, and these organizations, because of the fact that they are in leagues in the United States that are restricted in terms of the number of franchises that they can be held, they don't have an open franchise rule. As such, have a limited supply of teams that are available. And some of these teams, if they decide, hey, I want to move from market to market, this is what happened in my hometown of Nashville with the Titans when it moved from Houston. are able to go into other markets and say, we'd like to move to your market to establish, to bring our football team here. Will you build us a stadium? And that's what this Nashville's local government did back in the late 90s. They built them a stadium. And they're right now talking about replacing that stadium. It's only been there for 23, 24 years and already talking about replacing it. And the fact is that while the team is willing to partner with them on it, they're expecting some considerable local and state funding for this. And the reality is that theoretically, these teams could finance the stadium. There are teams that have financed their stadiums. The Patriots did it. The Cowboys did it. There are one or two other teams out there that have financed these stadiums on their own, but there are significant costs associated with that for the franchises. That's going to impact their profits because they're going to be directly responsible for the debt service. And so by using public financing, it's not that they don't have the ability to pay, it's that they're trying to eke out through rent seeking the best possible deal to be able to pad their bottom line. That's what's really going on here. If you look at the way that these leagues are set up, and this is true with the National Football League, as is true with Major League Baseball and the National Basketball Association, and to some degree with the NHL, these leagues are structured now in such that you can run a team, and due to the revenue sharing that these teams have and through TV rights and other business models, be able to generate a profit. It's hard to run a major league professional sports team in the United States and not make money. And so these organizations have the capacity to be able to do it, but there's a market out there of cities that would love to have them. I mean, Nashville has made it clear that they would love to have a professional baseball team now. And so there are a couple of markets out there like Oakland that are looking to see, hey, I'm not saying Oakland would move there, but there are teams out there that are looking to potentially relocate their franchises. And when they do that, they're going to want a new stadium built. They've been trying to get a new stadium built in Oakland for over a decade and haven't been able to get it. And they're trying to look at the best deal because they're trying to be in a position to make the most money possible. So that's probably the best example that I can give of rent seeking that does exist in the economy. And this does tie into public policy because there are opportunity costs associated with the way in which these local governments and state governments raise the money for this. They don't typically pay cash for it. They typically raise the money with debt. So it's not like they're taking out a current cash to pay for it, and they're usually using specialty tax means like occupancy tax or special tax allocations. But there are costs that are incurred by these governments that do create opportunity costs with respect to other programs and services that they could be providing their residents, or other ways they could be fostering economic development, tourism, or other things that the sports team will say that they do. So that kind of explains rent seeking a little more. There's also something else to realize, and they talk about a lot with the sugar example, because it really makes no sense in the United States why our sugar is more expensive than anywhere else, especially because we can produce it here and we can import it. It really makes no sense, but it does exist. And the reality is purely politics. There is no other good reason that we pay more for sugar, that we pay as much for sugar as we do. And I realize there's some health people out there that may feel a certain way about it, and that's fine. But taking that aside, there's no reason why, except that at the end of the day, it's a political decision, and it gets to this idea that all policy is political. At the end of the day, when it comes to the development of policy, all policy is going to have a political element to it. Now, it may not be much. It may be something that's very limited, but it still has an effect. And politics have to be factored into the equation when evaluating policy, when developing policy, when implementing policy, especially. I would say more so with the third, because as much as people make decisions in terms of what policy to implement, it also is the implementation process where you also deal with politics after the effect, and it's something you have to take into consideration. And then we also have to take into consideration the constraints. And two that are talked about here. One is technological. Obviously, there's only so much we have to take into consideration our ability and the means by which we can facilitate good governance. And then there's also the matter of incentive. And we've talked about that some over the course of this semester about incentives and how incentives for people can be different. And if you are not able to match up with the incentives of those who will be implementing or benefiting or being affected by this policy, chances are that does create an additional pressure against effective governments and policy implementation. Are there any questions at this point before we get into chapter 7? Okay. So we're going to talk about strategic adjustment, and they give a couple of different examples here. They talk about one of my least favorite topics, CAFE standards. What are CAFE standards?
Regulate the fuel efficiency of cars.
Yes. Basically, they came about as a result of the gas crisis of the early 70s, and they were meant to establish mandatory fuel efficiency standards with respect to light-duty automobiles, most of the vehicles that we see on the road today. What was one unintended consequence that they talk a little bit about here in their discussion of CAFE? It's more recent, but one thing that they talked about is that because of the way the CAFE standards treat cars and trucks differently, it led to the rise in the 90s of the minivan and, more importantly, the sport utility vehicle, or the SUV. And so what happened was that as automakers were trying to respond to customer desires to want to have some degree of size and certain characteristics in a vehicle, they began to figure out, how do we do this within the existing standards? It was very hard to do that and call it a car. Prior to this, there was this wonderful thing known as the station wagon. And my family had one when I was a kid. Some of you may have, which was basically a sedan, and it was there. And they tried to, and so station wagons were wonderful because they were on a car frame, but they allowed you to have enough room for everybody and all the stuff that you took with you. Unfortunately, that type of vehicle was hard to build under the CAFE standards at a reasonable size. My family had a Mazda GLC station wagon, which was a compact station wagon, which was not much at all. And Ford had the Escort station wagon. They also had the Taurus station wagon. But by the mid-90s, what they had figured out was that they built them on truck frames and had them declared as trucks. They could basically build whatever they wanted. And that led to this massive rise in the production of minivans. That actually started in the 80s when they took the van, the old style van, and just shrunk it a little bit and made it the minivan, and then also built the SUV on the truck frame. And that has dramatically, of course, transformed what we think of cars today. And we even deal with that now in the fact that automakers in the last couple of years, particularly, well, domestic automakers, have pretty much abandoned the construction of sedans. You cannot find a Ford, after next year, you will not be able to find a four-door sedan built by Ford, GM, or Chrysler. Chrysler's discontinuing the Charger Challenger model after this year. And they're basically, and part of that's been driven by the conversion to EV. Part of that's also is also the fact that it just makes more sense to just build on truck chassis. In the truck industry, what happened was they didn't see until very recently it's come back, but for several years, they didn't build compact pickup trucks. Something that had come about in response to fuel efficiency needs was actually discontinued. in order to meet in order to try to balance the portfolio of models with respect to CAFE standards. So compact pickup trucks went away for a while. They've come back to some degree. They needed to, because even the general base model full-size pickup truck was getting way too big. They're just huge compared to where they were 20 years ago. There is some effort to bring that back, but these are all efforts to try to adjust to policy. Then it also talks about another example it brings up is in the welfare to work program that came about in the mid 90s. This was after Bill Clinton became president in 1993, came in with what he thought was a center-left political agenda, decided to focus his first 2 years primarily on healthcare reform, failed, got defeated by a center-right to right Republican takeover of the legislature. And the skilled politician that he was, he decided to partner with them to some degree and facilitate a welfare reform plan that instigated this idea that they were going to try to that they would establish work requirements for long-term welfare participation. That it would be the goal that they would try to more mandate this progression of welfare to work. And what were some of the challenges they saw with that actually when they tried to implement it?
They just changed them from unemployed to disabled.
Yeah, very, very common thing was that states, when they got to this and they saw that they were not able to transition the individuals, they moved them over to disability. This has happened also at other times in the last 20 years. We also saw that a lot of people went off the rolls, but didn't necessarily gain a footing. The program wasn't successful, they just fell off it. And that was another challenge as well. And it created greater challenges in terms of how to provide services for them at the local level, because it became even more so a local responsibility rather than a shared responsibility between local, state, and federal resources. And this kind of gets to the challenge that we're in both cases, that we have to remember that when we're looking at policy, there's two things we have to consider. Number one, that even though we have the ability to grow supply, we don't live in a zero-sum game environment in all cases. We still have to remember that even though the opportunity to grow supply is out there, resources are always going to be limited. Just because we can grow wealth doesn't mean that necessarily government or the public sector can necessarily maintain its share of resources or be able to grow its share of resources to a level sufficient to implement the policies and programs that we seek to achieve. And honestly, and there's a reality that, generally speaking, when you look at the overall size of the economy, which continues to grow over time, there is a certain range of that share of that economy that can be a share tied to what the public sector does in terms of its programs and services and policy, whether and that includes direct payments like welfare programs, Social Security, other types of programs, that if it maintains a certain zone, overall, it does not negatively affect the economy. It could be too little or it could be too much. If the government consumes too much of the overall economy, it puts too much weight down on the economy. If it consumes too little, it has the potential to do not provide enough benefit to the economy overall to help its overall growth. So that's why, and that number changes over time, but generally speaking, we've seen with periods of good economic growth that government spending in a direct sense stays below a third of overall economic activity. And that's something we have to take into consideration. Now, short term, you can increase government spending to be able to stabilize the economy, to be able to foster certain activities, but it is not a long-term economic growth solution. Neither is what they call austerity, of significantly cutting government spending, because we have to remember that government is spending this money in the economy overall, and that is creating multiplier effects and certain degree of benefit. So there's kind of a sweet spot, as you would say, in terms of how much of the economy is dependent upon government spending or government use of resources. And our goal, generally speaking, is to try to kind of keep it in that area. And sometimes what that means is that if you're trying to keep it in that area, government's not going to be able to fulfill all the wants and wishes and dreams and ideas of policymakers, elected officials, or the public for that matter. So you kind of have to figure out where that balance is. What we also have to remember is that people adapt. That individuals, and I want to say this from an individual situation, individuals are generally can be resilient, and are in many ways are, and that there is a tendency that people have to individually and as a collective to be able to adjust their behaviors in response to policy action, both to potentially enable policy to be more effective, and often a lot of times to disable policy. Probably one of the most prime examples that we see regularly is that when we try to outlaw certain things, or try to or if we apply taxation as a coercive means of trying to prevent people from doing something, generally speaking, what that does is that it creates a black market effect. It creates the idea that people will establish illegal markets outside the control of law to be able to trade in those particular goods. That's one of the criticisms that's been made about the attempts to try to criminalize or make drugs illegal. So, at the end of the day, people do adapt to the environment in which, and the policies for which they're confronted with. And as such, it makes it to where there's going to be limitations with respect to the implementation of policy. So let's look a little more into a specific issue, and that deals with strategic adversaries. So someone want to define for me, or kind of give me a general understanding that they have of what they mean by strategic adversary.
To kind of put it simply and briefly, you got to make a decision of where to spend a minimum amount of money in policy to make a decision to, like in the counterterrorism, do we protect group A or B? As the example that the book gave, we only got XYZ amount of money. We got to balance that out to the strategic adjustment.
True. So in the particular example, if your resources are limited, if you're fighting a situation where there are going to be multiple fronts in a military or a quasi-military operation, like our battles in counterterrorism, you're facing a situation where you've got a number of potential threats and targets, and you're trying to decide where does it make the most sense to direct your resources. And this was obvious, and it's not just with money, it's also with manpower and other resources. This may be, one of the challenges of what we saw in the war on terror from 2002 until 2000 and up until probably last year with the fall of Afghanistan, was the fact that the US never put itself in a position where it truly focused its resources on fighting this in the way that it focused its resources in fighting in World War II. It chose this to be an additional program of policy, similar to how we had fought Vietnam. where we simply just added it to the portfolio of what the government did. Now, we still did a lot, and that's not to say that we didn't. At the same time, we established this operation, and we found ourselves in two military theaters, Iraq and Afghanistan, and we also saw ourselves in a variety of other theaters in different means. And the real question becomes is, where were we focusing the assets? And there are those who would argue that, initially our assets were focused on Afghanistan. That was the first target. We were able to remove the Taliban from power. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban from power. We did not truly defeat them. We removed them from power. And we attempted to try to engage in nation building there in Afghanistan. But at the same time, as soon as we began that multifaceted operation in Afghanistan, we then began to focus attention on Iraq and begin to look at a regime change operation there, which would be initiated by a military response, followed by an attempt to establish a friendly government there. So we were taking on two operations at the same time in two different areas that were not necessarily geographically close to each other, and not geographically close to the United States. And in some ways, you could argue that there are many failures that occurred, but obviously spreading of resources too thin would obviously be one of those to factor into the consideration. But the reality was that these determinations were made based on the fact that it was determined that when they made calculations similar to those described in the book, where initially they determined it made sense to go to Afghanistan. That's where we believed bin Laden was, or at least where we said bin Laden was. That's where we believed the greatest threat in terms of the center focus of Al-Qaeda was. And then for some reason we determined later, and I'm not going to get in, there's obviously many different explanations for this. We determined that there was a greater threat potentially from Iraq. And that was why we chose then to move our focus to Iraq instead of trying to focus on Afghanistan and trying to establish some degree of certainty there. Not to say that we were the first country to try that. Several countries before us tried to establish some degree of Western allied government in Iraq and Afghanistan, and failed miserably before we did. So the reality though is that in these situations, you are dealing with multiple threats or multiple negative situations, but you have to make a decision based on what you think creates the most value in terms of your response. And that it's a challenge, and that's as much of a challenge for us as it is others. Does anybody else want to add with respect to this topic? It can be counterterrorism or another example.
Was the book kind of saying like that we should spread our resources in a way that, like, basically putting ourselves into the perspectives of our adversaries instead of from the perspectives of what our priorities are? I couldn't quite understand what it was saying.
That's been a common criticism. That's true, and it's been a common criticism that was made initially after the 9/11 attacks. There were those who said that we needed to be more mindful of the mindset of those who were engaging against us. Naturally, that's a very hard statement to make after such a violent attack like September 11th. The natural human reaction to something like that is, I don't care what they think, just go ahead and take them out. And it was not, and as you can imagine, it was not met with a tremendous amount of support. It was widely ridiculed. It's the reason why, generally speaking, generally speaking, you want there to be some degree of time for consideration, not meaning that you don't take a responsive action, but that you seriously evaluate the conditions that are there. And so the fact that there was in the author's mind that there was a lack of true consideration of terrorist motive. Generally speaking, we tend to understate terrorist motives. We generally categorize them as they hate us and don't want to. They hate us. Now that can always be true, and at the same time, there are things that have to be considered, and particularly with respect to Bin Laden and Al Qaeda, we knew that this was a far more different matter, because as we've learned that we had in the past actually helped facilitate his regime, not directly but indirectly, when we were basically fighting a proxy war with the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s. That those same terrorists, in some ways, that then came to attack us on September 11th were much aligned with those that have been fighting on our side in the 1980s with the help of the CIA and other agencies. So there is a lot of, and that's the challenge, but at the same time, then it comes about, what exactly are they fighting for? Because at the end of the day, you only get resolute fighters, as we're learning right now in the case of what the Russians are facing in the Ukraine, where they don't have resolute fighters. They're basically taking people right out of induction and sticking them on the battlefield. If you don't have you got to have resolute fighters to be successful in a campaign, and the question becomes, what are they fighting for? And you have to take that into consideration. Now, what they're fighting for may not align with your values or align with human dignity. That's always a possibility. And at the same time, you have to have a clear understanding of that. And that, I think, is his point, is trying to really try to understand that, because it gives you an idea of how do you overcome it, and whether certain concepts like trying to apply a Western model of democracy to a part of the world that, generally speaking, is not set up culturally. Take religion out of the question. Afghanistan, for example, is a tribal Bedouin culture. It's a country that most of its residents go from place to place. They're not permanent inhabitants necessarily in one given area. Some are, not all. And so the question is, can you really have a functioning Western style government and Western style culture in that area? You probably can't. So the question is, if you realize that the threat is real and the threat needs to be neutralized from the standpoint of who's in power, then how do you help them create something that fulfills their interest and at the same time also fulfills your interests? But again, that's always going to be a challenge with nation building, and that's why it works very rarely. True, we want a two-party system, unless we do like a two-party system. So we'll talk a little bit about the war on drugs. And I'll just reference the first paragraph. Second sentence: if the government tightens airport security, terrorists take hostages in some other locations. If the government makes it more difficult to move drugs in the United States through some entry point, the drug smugglers find a different route, often with toxic effects along the new route. We're seeing that right now with what's going on at the Mexican border. We have taken, we're not only seeing it in terms of the tactics that are being used on the border, but also the nature of the drugs itself, as we have fought a variety of drugs and tried to go after, particularly this rise in synthetic drugs that have happened over the last 15 or so years. We're seeing this explode. We continue to see these drugs become more concentrated and more lethal. Fentanyl, which does have a prescription value to it, in its straight form is a highly deadly drug, and it is being easily and right now it is being primarily manufactured outside the United States and being brought in through the southern border. And we realize that that's a major challenge, and it's the continuation of a policy with respect to combating drugs that has been around for about 100 years, but in reality has really been a focus since the 1970s, starting off with cocaine, heroin, and marijuana, and continuing to move. And interestingly enough, as we've tried to combat those drugs, the drugs themselves have changed dramatically over that time. And that does not take into consideration the fact that perhaps the biggest drug crisis that we faced in the last 20 years was actually facilitated by a drug that was available by prescription, and that was OxyContin. So there's a lot of examples that they give here, and they really primarily focus on talk a little bit about what's going on in Mexico, but also particularly what goes on in the Caribbean and Central America. What were some conclusions that you were able to derive from some of the examples that were discussed here?
I know one of the things that was interesting to me was talking about, I guess I'm looking for his name, Kleiman, essentially just talking about like targeting the more violent drug trafficking organizations as a way to self-correct. I thought that was really interesting to think about because it, induces a race to the bottom. So everybody's trying to be less and less violent. In an ideal world, that would be great. It would be kind of interesting to see how that would work in practice, but just like kind of exploiting their own behavior against them. And the idea is that if the more violent you are, the more resources that are thrown at you to stop you, and the less drugs you can move, and the better it becomes for people who are doing less violent crime. I thought that was an interesting approach.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily stop the drug trade, but it does eliminate one of the. It's you're really treating a side effect.
Right.
So obviously, by making an enterprise a criminal enterprise, you're inviting criminals into it, or you're inviting criminal behavior into it. And human nature shows us that once you invite criminal behavior, there's a tendency for it to go that kind of escalates itself. And so we have to understand that. I think that's an issue that we deal with. We have, of course, we seem to be having more and more discussions domestically about trying to at least decriminalize drugs, not necessarily legalize them outright, but decriminalize them. And I think this kind of ties into it. It's the idea that, generally speaking, there is still a sizable percentage of the population that does not see the accepted presence of these drugs to be good for society, whatever the drug may be. I'm not saying that that's right. I'm just saying that tends to be when they look at society as a whole, not in particular age groups or such, there's generally a lack of appreciation. But then there's also the fact that, well, if we aren't going to necessarily legal it, can we at least make it to where it is not such a situation that it encourages that it feeds a behavior, or that it feeds an environment that can lead to worse behavior. Like what we're seeing right now, legalizing marijuana, for example, in certain states has not ended the involvement of criminal activity in marijuana in those states. It's actually escalated in some cases. One of the thoughts was, well, if we legalized it, theoretically that would reduce some of the criminal activity. It hasn't. And at least not as much as we thought it was. And so these are circumstances that we're continuing to face as we deal with this. There's also there's a lot of factors we have to take into consideration. Anything else anybody would like to share? So we get into this next discussion, and the author actually uses a personal example. And it's an example that some of y'all are probably aware of about the challenges that public school teachers face in determining to achieve the goals and objectives that are set by them by modern public education policy. How many of y'all have been or are currently a public school teacher? Okay. Some of you probably had some involvement with this for many decades now, in particular states, but also the last 20 years nationally. School teachers have been faced with a challenge, and it provides a way of looking at this issue of trying to incentivize multiple tasks. And for example, the issue that teachers face with trying to achieve educational performance, trying to help their students achieve educational performance, which is then a measure of their performance as teachers and the performances of their school and education system. In a layman's approach, it makes sense. Obviously, we want high-performing schools, we want high-performing students, we want high-performing teachers. So from a conventional perspective, it makes a lot of sense, but there are a lot of challenges that have to be taken into consideration. What are some of the factors that have to be looked at here? What are some of the tasks that teachers face in terms of trying to achieve this?
Would it be the direct outcome of the education that the kids are receiving?
That's a possibility. That, what does it lead to? And that's not something that's necessarily as effectively evaluated, with the exception of two areas. There's ways you could do it. It's just not been incorporated. You could look at high school graduation rate, maybe, college acceptance rate, job entry, college graduation rate. Those are potential outcomes, but they're not as much factored into the evaluation criteria as they should be. Mostly it's factored on immediate short-term performance. Anybody else? So if you go to page 206, top of page 206, his sister's story illustrates a classic problem. How do we create incentives for achieving an outcome that requires multiple inputs? Because there are multiple inputs that can affect what a student is facing. Like any school, going back to page 205, like any public school teacher in the United States in the 21st century, she spends a lot of her time worrying about standardized tests. That's, of course, the main metric that's used to track educational performance. Her fate, the fate of her students, and the fate of her school depend on test scores. She describes what is a very familiar story to anyone who follows contemporary education debates. She's given the pressure that she has to help her students perform well on tests. She focuses a fair bit of effort on teaching test-relevant skills, sometimes at the expense of other skills that may be more important for the students in question, but are less useful for the test. So this gets back to the teaching by the test standard that a lot of teachers feel that they're forced into, where their curriculum is less about developing the students' aptitude or even knowledge area in a given subject, but is more focused on simply being able to perform to an expectation when they're taking a performance test. Going back to 206, her story illustrates a classic problem. How do we create incentives for achieving an outcome that requires multiple inputs when some of the inputs are better measured than others? The output we care in primary education is how well the students are educated. The author, this is somewhat the author here saying, the output we care about in primary education is how well the children are educated in some encompassing sense. And this is very hard to observe. Some of the inputs might include teacher effort devoted to math, teacher effort devoted to literacy, and teacher effort devoted to socio-emotional skills. Each of these is also difficult for an outsider to observe directly. So instead, we observe course performance measures like test scores. These scores are probably informative about the outcome we care about, overall education in each of the inputs, but they are certainly not equivalent to any of them. Moreover, a performance measure like test scores is likely more informative about some of the inputs like math skills than others, like socio-emotional skills. So when you give teachers incentives based on test scores, you push them to emphasize the skills that translate into test scores at the expense of skills that don't. So what we have is a situation where, because you're dealing with the fact that no teacher, obviously, like for example, a math teacher wants his or her students to perform well at math. But the reality is that there are other things that they realize that they're trying to achieve as a teacher as well. And this is at the K through 12 level. Maybe not as much so at the college, at the undergraduate level or the graduate level, but certainly is supposed to be the case in primary and secondary education from K to 12. And while you obviously want them to improve their performance in the subject area they're working with, there are other things you're trying to do because these are children. You're trying to help them in other ways. The problem is that, as the author points out, the only thing that's being measured in this performance evaluation is their performance in the given subject. Interestingly enough, it's possible that improving other skills, including socio-emotional skills, can also help improve academic skills. But most teachers in the course of their study are not necessarily prepared as much to do that. That comes with experience. The challenge is that their ability to gain experience, particularly for those that are entering the system, is dependent upon their ability to create performance results in the given subject. So it kind of creates a catch-22 situation for those teachers. So it creates, you create trade-offs as they describe here. And as such, the teachers are oftentimes focused are led to focus on given subject matter, and they structure it in a way that potentially enables a student to remember it, memorize it, and be able to perform it on a test, but does not necessarily indicate whether, one, that they're going to be able to apply it outside of the boundaries of what they've learned, which of course is important to the learning process. We want people to be able to take what we teach them. As teachers, we want students to be able to take what we teach them and be able to apply it beyond the boundaries of what we discuss with them directly. And also from the standpoint of developing other skills which they can use to apply that information as well. So this kind of creates a quandary that we deal with. And this is a challenge throughout all measures. And this also gets into a challenge that we have in government when it comes to this push in government for performance measurement, particularly when it comes to local governments. Performance measurement is highly valued and widely applied in local government, and there are efforts to try to benchmark performance across jurisdictions within states or nationwide. And there is often a lack of consideration of the resources and the situations that organizations face, and the likelihood that even though some jurisdictions might have measures that indicate higher levels of performance, that there are factors that they possess that are not necessarily replicable. that it's not necessarily able to, for another jurisdiction that's lower performing, to replicate those same situations. So these are factors that we have to take into consideration. And that's why we have to be careful that while it's important to evaluate performance at an individual level, it's important to see how people improve individually, or individual jurisdictions improve individually. The challenges we can often run into come when we try to compare across populations, not taking into consideration potential socioeconomic characteristics, resource limitations, other factors that can contribute to differences and disparities, not understanding that we are still potentially having the ability to achieve improvements in performance across the board, just in different ways. Does that make sense? Okay. Are there any other questions with respect to chapter 7? Okay. So talk about dynamic inconsistency. And one of my favorite examples, the launching of healthcare.gov. For those of you who had to live through using it, I am really sorry for you. Of all the things that could go wrong in the implementation of a massive transformational federal project, this was probably the one that nobody expected, and yet it happened. And it talks in here a lot about a lot of the reasons and just a lot of challenges that occurred. That's something that should have been given a lot more attention and a lot more care and focused than it was, just the fact that it wasn't. And at the bottom of page 218, the episode illustrates a general problem in governance, dynamic inconsistencies. To try to create incentives for good performance, the agency that was responsible, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, also known as CMS, asserted that the contractor who was building the site would be held accountable for actions taken throughout the process. However, once a given task was completed by the contractor, CMS was primarily concerned with achieving good outcomes going forward. So as such, it was willing to renegotiate along the way of the contract, i.e. not holding up to the same timeline and the same benchmarks that they originally established when they realized that there was problems occurring through the development of the website, in order to optimize incentives going forward. This commitment problem meant that the standards announced early in the process were not credible. So governments face a variety of commitment problems, a variety of problems of dynamic inconsistency. 3 will be considered. We're going to consider 1, commitment problems that underestimate the credibility of policy promises of the sort just described, the desire to pass costs for current projects onto future generations, and incentives to take inefficient actions that preserve the current power structure. So this kind of gets into behaviors. This kind of provides a, and Chris, you're right, they didn't mention that. It was, but I think they're looking at it was that since ACA was facilitated by a contractor, that they were independent of that, but you make a good point. The reality, and I actually, there's different examples, of course, of inconsistency, and timing is the first one. And I shared a video with respect to timing, showing kind of what time inconsistencies are. The time inconsistency problem is where a situation where a policy is implemented in the future. This policy is created to be Pareto improving. However, anticipating the policy, people make decisions today that can influence the optimal policy tomorrow. And so as a result, when tomorrow comes, the still benevolent government wants to implement a different policy than previously announced. Hence, the people were wrong to believe the initial promise, although at the time the government meant it. So this is what often happens when government tries to adapt to what's going on and doesn't just stick to what it said it was going to do in the first place. Anybody want to give an example of this? offer an example that they can think of. Quiet room tonight. So let's go down to the bottom of page 219. Obviously, a lot of times this comes up with respect to monetary policy, and we can focus on the Phillips curve. And it talks about that the Phillips curve suggests that in the short run, central banks can face a trade-off between high inflation and low unemployment. Imagine, geez, it doesn't sound like anything we're living through. Standard economic analysis says that this relationship depends on expectations about inflation. A central bank can use inflation to lower unemployment only if inflation exceeds expected inflation. So hence the central bank would like the market to expect low inflation so that it can lower unemployment without increasing inflation too much. So for example, the Federal Reserve has for a pretty long time worked with what they believe is their dual mandate, which is low inflation and low unemployment. And so it is trying, in a sense, to try to balance this. It creates a very low inflation expectation, which is around 2 to 3%, which we've luckily, up until very recently, been able to achieve overall for a pretty significant period of time. And in doing that, it tries to create a situation where, in order to rise, to be able to increase jobs and lower unemployment, if inflation has to increase, it's only increasing by a small amount. So let's say, obviously we had the situation of the COVID lockdown, which created a significant amount of unemployment, both temporary and long-term. And so naturally, because we knew that there was going to be a need to increase employment to try to recover the jobs that had been lost, you could say that due to the Phillips curve, that there should be some expectation that there was going to be some rise of inflation. Now, naturally, the expectation was that inflation would not go up as high as it has gone up now. But the idea that somehow we were going to be able to see inflation stay at 2 to 3% after COVID, with all the intervention that we took in terms of monetary policy over the post-COVID period, was not to be expected. And this was, this is where I think some economists thought that we were going to be dealing with what they thought was going to be a transitory situation, that there was going to be a brief period of inflation, that unemployment would return back to pre-COVID level, and then inflation would subside. That's not what happened here. The curve went out of whack. So that is something that we can think about. The other thought is looking at from the standpoint of taxes and savings. And this creates a time inconsistency problem as well. And what we know is that sometimes that depending on how tax policy is implemented, it changes behavior, citizen behavior with respect to how they save or spend or use money. So continuing on page 220, there is a government and they are customers. Each consumer has one unit of money. For this purpose, we will assume that there is a very large number of consumers, and in particular, there are so many consumers that each consumer's wealth is negligible or minimal relative to the size of the economy. This assumption simplifies the analysis because when a consumer makes a savings decision, she will not worry about that decision, how that decision affects the total amount of taxes collected by the government, since she is so small relative to the tax base. So the government announces a planned future tax rate on savings. This tax rate, however, is non-binding. Each consumer divides their money between consumption and savings. The government sets a capital tax rate, and then the government spends the revenues it collects on providing a public good. And what we typically see is in the first best example on page 221, money invested instead of consumed generates positive returns. Hence, the first best option, saving everything maximizes total resources available. But what will the government do when it happens in equilibrium? Let's suppose that the government has made some promise and the customers have all made some choice. What tax policy will the government actually implement? If the government's being benevolent, they will choose a tax rate that maximizes social welfare. This means that the government will ignore its promised policy. The government identifies the socially optimal tax rate by balancing the cost of taxation against the benefits of taxation. And that's oftentimes what happens. What that does, of course, it can create a problem, because it is not promising, even though it still acts benevolently, it does not create a circumstance where it has held up its promise. And this is kind of what politicians do. Politicians have a tax plan that they put in place when they run for office, particularly presidents or governors. And they bring that plan forward, and people start planning based on that, particularly if they have, for example, let's use the national example, if a president and the majority in both houses of Congress are of the same political party, there's a belief that there's going to be symmetry in policy and that that's going to be achieved. However, that's not always the case. There is some degree of horse trading that goes on, and as a result, the policy shifts, and that changes the behavior. And it can diminish the results and also create challenges for both the government and the consumer. So another issue, and this gets to the passing the buck example that we talk about, dynamic inconsistency, deals with fiscal manipulation. One of the biggest problems that we face in public finance at the state and local level, not as much thankfully in North Carolina, but we still have an issue, has to do with our pension funds for retired employees. For those of you who work in state employment or for local employment in North Carolina that are part of the statewide system for local governments known as ELGRs, our pension funds are generally well funded. That is not true for state employees that are part when it comes to their retiree health benefits. That's the OPEB example, other post-employee benefits. But generally, in other states like Illinois, Kentucky, New York, California, and others, there are significant unfunded liabilities with respect to pensions. And these could, and in many cases will, create serious challenges for these states in the future, which is coming faster, especially because stock returns have been terrible this year, to potentially create immediate short-term fiscal strain if these governments are forced to have to pay out these obligations in cash, or are forced to have to apply haircuts or reductions in benefits to those who have already been promised benefits, which may be possible in some cases, but not necessarily possible in all cases. The only reasonable solution in these cases is to increase the amount of money flowing into the funds to cover these liabilities so that they can be properly invested, which means increasing the level of contributions that are made not just by the governments, but also by the employees who are receiving the benefit. So for example, here in North Carolina, state employees as well as those municipal employees that are part of the state system have for decades contributed 6% of their pay to the pension plan. When I started here in 2006, municipal governments were contributing a little less than 5% of their pay. And that has now gone up due to the efforts to try to maintain funding levels up to over 12%. So at this point now, and that's still a low number compared to what governments have to contribute in other parts of the country. In some cases, they're contributing 25 to 30%. But here in North Carolina, we're contributing 12. Governments are contributing around 12, 12 and a half, and a little more for public safety workers. But the reality is that, as I've pointed out, that you've gone from a situation where the employee was contributing more than the employer to where the employer is contributing twice as much as the employee. And it creates a challenge because obviously jurisdictions are only going to be able to contribute so much in terms of in order to balance their budgets in an effective long-term manner. And at some point, depending on how circumstances play itself out, the state or local governments may be forced to say to their employees, you will have to make a higher contribution, say to 7 or 8%. But we realize that there are sizable political risks to asking for this. There is also sizable political risk to restructuring budgets so that governments, like, for example, the state of North Carolina, contribute more to cover their unfunded liabilities with respect to the retiree health plan. The state of North Carolina had an opportunity this past summer with its $6 billion budget surplus that it could have applied a share of that money to retiree health. And they chose not to. And it came down to the political preference side, also the electoral risk because it's an election year, that money they felt could be better spent on other things. Now, generally speaking, North Carolina's budgeting compared to a lot of other states is a lot more conservative, but still, the fact that they did not apply, that they simply passed, that they have continued to pass that buck and engage in that degree of fiscal manipulation, in the fact that this continues to be a sizable liability, that doesn't, in the case of North Carolina, doesn't put us underwater, but still is still something that has to be dealt with, creates a significant challenge. And it's a serious issue that we deal with, consistency. Like I said, in North Carolina, it's not as serious of an issue. It is a very serious issue in other states. Probably the most notable are Illinois and Kentucky, who have had serious unfunded pension obligation issues, and it actually affected Illinois' credit rating. But the reality is that this is an ongoing issue that governments face. There have been efforts over the last decade to establish better accounting of these liabilities and to incorporate them into financial statements, but at the same time, they're not really applied in a way to where they truly exact the effect that needs to be shown in order to show whether or not these states are underwater when these obligations and liabilities are applied appropriately, like they would in a corporate environment. We also then have the issue of future power, when policy affects future power. And one good example, going back to sugar, that it talks about has to do with the way in which some legislation is adopted. That's correct, Mary Cole. It's not. That's right. It's not offered to newly hired state employees. So it kind of minimizes the growth in that benefit, but it's still a sizable benefit nonetheless. I mean, it's still a significant financial issue, but you're correct. So there are certain elements. So when federal governments pass legislation, certain types of appropriation legislation is multi-year in nature. And this is true with transportation legislation. It's also true with agriculture legislation. So there's a highway bill that's often talked about, a transportation bill that's often talked about, that's adopted about every 4 to 5 years. And then there's also the farm bill, which is readopted every 4 or 5 years. Absolutely, Mary. So we end up with the issue. So they give an example here. Suppose the world economy has changed in a way that makes farming in the US a less viable activity than it was 30 years ago. It is very difficult for a 50-year-old farmer to retain and change industry. So hence the government might well want to use a policy to help that farmer. If the US government wants to support current farmers, it would be efficient to provide direct transfers rather than pursuing the current policy of propping up prices, restricting imports, and subsidizing agricultural inputs. Such policies distort prices, yes they do, and lead to an inefficiently high level of investment in agriculture rather than other more productive industries. Agricultural subsidies are thus an inefficient way to compensate farmers for changing economic conditions. And so that's a prime example. The problem, of course, we run into is that farmers, particularly large farmers, have very strong political interest. And so a lot of times these policies are, particularly when it comes to agriculture subsidies, they have been transformed into considerable benefit programs and rent seeking for larger scale interest groups. So whereas theoretically, crop subsidy policy really does not benefit small farmers anymore, and it really doesn't. It is still the method that is used, and of course, it has this profound future effect that we deal with. And this is a challenge. Now agriculture has some unique characteristics to it. Possibly everything with respect to federal contracts and oil and drilling. One of the arguments that could be made for why the current administration has been hesitant to expand drilling rights is the fact that it is trying to redirect energy production to renewables by not encouraging policy that continues to have the ability to increase supply and thus maintain a lower price. If the goal is to eventually substitute the source of energy from fossil fuel to renewables, you would want to, through policy, do what you can to minimize the ability for the method that you're trying to reduce to remain at a lower cost. And by such, you are enabling the other sources like renewables to have a more equivalent price. So that's a good example. Let's go to another example that we often think about, and that involves gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is a very challenging situation that we deal with, in that you have a system in terms of how districts are drawn that is controlled by those who are in power, and it is structured to their benefit, regardless of what party's in power. And this is, commentary on the history of the American Southeast. When the Democrat Party was in control of most of the Southeast throughout most of the 20th century, they utilized gerrymandering to their advantage. Republicans, when they took over, utilized gerrymandering to their advantage. That's a pretty consistent history. Now, there are some other factors that have to be considered in as well. But the reality is that gerrymandering is nothing new, and that's a very common factor, and it does have significant future impact because theoretically, though not always, when gerrymandering takes effect, if it's upheld by courts, if it's upheld by the Department of Justice, those maps stay in power for a long time. They stay in effect for 10 years. And so it can further challenge the ability for proper distribution of power, because obviously it's not done with the intent for I guess you could say appropriate representation of the populace. It's designed for representation based on the political interest, primarily of whoever is the political majority at a given time, and also whoever the entrenched interests are. And that can also be true with citizen-led redistricting. It all depends on which citizens are involved. So these are realities that we face that have to be dealt with and continue to be a challenge. So, are there any questions with respect to Chapter 8? Okay. So we're going to take just a little bit of time to do an exercise, and I'm going to split you all up into groups of 4. If you go to page 243 in your text, question 4, it has been argued that one cause of the financial crisis of 2007 was banks taking excessive risk. Following the crisis, reform advocates argued for breaking up banks that were deemed too big to fail. Based on what we've studied in Chapter 8, provide an argument for the merits of this policy. So what you're using, based on the information that we've covered in Chapter 8 regarding dynamic inconsistency, you're looking to provide an argument for why large banks should be broken up to prevent future financial crises. So let me set up let me stop the share. Go to breakout rooms. It's going to be groups of 4, 3, 6. There'll be 2 groups of 3, I believe. And you'll have 15 minutes. And so we'll gather back up at 8:15. All right. See you then.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. So wait for everybody to get back on. Okay. All right. So hope y'all had a good chance to discuss it. What are some arguments we can make based on what we learned in Chapter 8 with respect to the idea of breaking up big banks? Christopher, yes.
So I was in a group with Mary Cole and Keston, and one of the things that we discussed was rent seeking, and that, with this guarantee of too big to fail, that these financial institutions basically have an infinite rent without adding utility to the system, that the government will take whatever measures necessary to prevent their failure or collapse. And under a market system like we want to have, in most cases, these financial institutions would have failed, and the message from that would have been to not have the practices that these financial institutions had, not just making risky loans, but also packaging them together and selling them in the way that they did as investment
Absolutely.
opportunities.
Good point.
And I also mentioned, just because I want to say this, bring back Glass-Steagall. Separate financial institutions.
Yeah, I had a history. It's funny you mentioned that. I had a history teacher in 1998 when that was being 1998, 1999, when Congress struck it down. That was making a huge deal about that because Glass-Steagall, as Christopher brought up, separated it basically said that banks could not be in the market, could not be in the business of market investments. They could do financial stuff, but they couldn't do markets. And the reason why was that during the Depression, one of the reasons why there were significant runs on banks was because banks lost a tremendous amount of money because they had loaned it out to people to buy stock on margin. So basically, investment banks were also providing deposit service, and as such, that further exacerbated the problem. And so Glass-Steagall was passed in the 30s to try to prevent that. It was struck down in the late 90s. My teacher at that time had covered a lot, was basically his area of focus was from about 1880 to 1940, and spoke very, basically was sounding alarm bells, and he was proven right. But unfortunately, I doubt in the modern marketplace that that's going to happen. It didn't happen with Dodd-Frank, which would have made the most sense for it to happen. But it did not make it into the soup when they were passing Dodd-Frank. So that's how that went. Anybody else have something to have an argument they'd like to make?
Yeah, so in our group, we talked about how the sheer size of the few banks, and Charisma mentioned the umbrella effect that it would have. If they were to fail, then a lot of people rely on those few banks, and it would just create, absolute absolute chaos, if they were to fail. And then having those few institutions, this is a separate point, is like they're gigantic, and their sheer size gives them a lot of influence and lobbying power. So I think Chris just mentioned that too. I can't remember.
Well, no, I mean,
so yeah,
that's absolutely true. Go ahead.
Oh, no, that was, you go ahead.
Okay. No, it's the problem, the challenge that you have with large institutions like the banking industry, and this was something that it took me time to learn. Prior to the late 70s, early 80s, the banking industry in the United States was still predominantly state-based, because of the way banking regulations were in given states, and that there was very little interstate banking in terms of a bank having a presence in more than one state. That changed in part because of the arrival of electronic payments, the original, the use of credit cards, the availability of credit cards, kind of changed things. And it led to this idea that banks could be chartered in one state and could actually cooperate in multiple states, this idea of having truly nationalized banking institutions. Prior to that, most banks, 99% of banks were basically only within one state. And of course, now you have a market where you have these large national banks that have consolidated through merger and acquisition over time, that have a sizable share of the overall market. And the challenge, of course, as you put it into, is that if they are in a position to fail, like it was thought they were in 2008, then it could create a catastrophic the umbrella effect would come in and create a catastrophic effect across the economy. And that was the reason for that. And what it also does, obviously, is that there's a political incentive for the standpoint of the politicians, because it also concentrates their focus in terms of who they have to deal with. It can create an iron triangle effect between the banking industry and politicians, because with so few banks controlling such a size of the market share, it basically says, well, if we work out policy with this group, we can work it out pretty much with everything. So it allows them to influence policy to a greater degree by working with a smaller number of banks, because they have such large market share. And that obviously, so it does work both ways. The question is, does it work in a way that's beneficial to the protection of the consumer? And it's clear that currently not really, that there are some significant problems. And ideally, ideally looking back on it, there are a lot of lessons that we could have learned to it. It was a rush decision in terms of the efforts that were made to bail them out in 2008. It happened within a matter of about a week or a couple of days. And it was a situation that potentially could have had a different response if more time had been given to it, as opposed to trying to solve it very quickly. Yes, Shantanu.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. So in my group, we kind of like I kind of like brought this point up about the whole issue regarding like the issuing of like subprime loans and the fact that these banks since they thought that they were like too much of a fail, like kind of like played a part in them like basically being okay with like issuing like those like subprime loans, which kind of like would kind of play like a big part in like the financial crisis and all that. So I just like kind of want to get your thoughts on that. Like,
That's part of it, but it's also important to understand that these loans were created. These loans were not necessarily created with the idea that they were going to fail. A lot of these loans were not created with the idea that they were going to fail and then result in a bailout. They were created with the idea that they were not going to fail. This was based on, a lot of this was based on probability math, advanced probability math that had been developed, and the idea being that this model concept of the MBS, the mortgage-backed security, and the significant radicalization that it underwent, the real thought was they thought they had built an instrument that could be sustainable. Many people did. Not saying that there are those who didn't. Obviously, there was a certain group of people, wrote a book and made a movie about them, who believed it's going to fail, and they bet right. But the reality is that there were a lot of people that were involved in this industry that thought that the product wasn't going to fail. They truly believed that, and so and that's why a lot of we have to remember that the bailout this bailout didn't start when the first banks went down. There were two banks in particular that went down before the bailout was really facilitated, and that was Bear Stearns and blanking on the other one.
Lehman Brothers.
Lehman Brothers. Thank you. Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers both went bankrupt and collapsed. They did not survive. And it was only after those first two failed, and it was only after those first two failed, after minimal liquidity efforts by the Federal Reserve, did they begin to look at the situation and make the decision that something of a larger scale needed to happen. And that's why they made the decision to do what they did. But it would be, I don't believe, and granted, history may prove, continued discovering of history may tell me wrong. It would not be accurate to say that all the parties that were involved thought that, hey, this is going to fail and the government's going to bail us out on it. That was not necessarily intent. There were likely some who did, but there were a lot of people who saw it as an investment opportunity, that they thought they had figured out a way. And this is something that continues to happen throughout history. They thought they had created an economic product that was bulletproof. Basically, they thought they had a bulletproof product, and and then you saw this massive trading on top of it with the CDOs. And don't even ask me to try to explain that. But the fact was, you saw an even greater speculation in the markets because of that. And it just further exacerbated the collapse when it occurred. So anybody else got any other arguments they would like to make? Okay. So we're going to have something, there will be a class on October 4th. and I will share more information about that. It will not be in person. I will tell you that. So it'll either be Zoomed or recorded. But we will have one, and it will cover Chapter 9, the need for information, to the next part of constraints on good governance. The podcast 2 assignment is up on the podcast, What is a Price? You can go to the link that's in this presentation or the link that I emailed out to everybody, and the responses are due by 6 p.m. next Tuesday. And remember, you'll be on fall break on October 11th, so we will not have class on October 11th. And I will also confirm everybody's presentation topics this week. So I'll make sure that everybody knows what their topics are in the next day or two for their groups. Are there any questions? Okay, thank you all very much for tuning in tonight, and I will see you again next week. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.